Margaret Chen never expected her small button factory in downtown Chicago to become part of history. She had inherited the business from her father, who started it with nothing but determination and a single sewing machine in 1952. For 30 years, she produced ordinary buttons for clothing manufacturers across the Midwest. Her workers knew every stitch, every pattern, every shade of thread that passed through their machines. The morning of September 12, 2001, changed everything. Margaret arrived at the factory to find her employees gathered around an old television set, their faces pale with shock. The towers had fallen, the Pentagon burned. A field in Pennsylvania held the wreckage of heroes who fought back. America wept, and Margaret wept with them. In the days that followed, orders slowed to a trickle. Fashion seemed unimportant when the world felt so fragile. Margaret watched her workers worry about their jobs, their families, their future. She had always been practical, focused on profit margins and delivery schedules. But something stirred in her heart as she watched the endless news coverage, the faces of the missing, the stories of ordinary people who became heroes in their final moments. 3 weeks after the attacks, a phone call changed the course of her business forever. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a representative from a major uniform manufacturer in New York. The company had received a massive order from the federal government. They needed millions of buttons for military uniforms, police uniforms, firefighter gear, and emergency responder clothing. The order was so large that they needed to contract with smaller manufacturers across the country. Margaret accepted the contract without hesitation. Her factory buzzed with renewed energy as workers prepared for the biggest order in the company's history. But as Margaret studied the specifications late into the night, an idea began to form in her mind. These buttons would fasten the uniforms of America's protectors. They would hold together the clothing of men and women who risked their lives for others. Surely, she thought, there must be a way to honor the fallen while serving the living. She began researching the victims of September 11th. Margaret spent hours reading their stories, learning their names, understanding their dreams. There was Jonathan, the firefighter who called his wife one last time before climbing the stairs. Maria, the office worker who helped disabled colleagues evacuate before the building collapsed. David, the passenger who fought back on Flight 93. Each name became sacred to her, each story a thread in the fabric of American courage. Margaret made a decision that would remain secret for decades. She would find a way to weave their memory into every button her factory produced. It would be subtle, invisible to the casual observer, but meaningful to those who knew where to look. The buttons would carry more than thread and fabric. They would carry the weight of remembrance, the strength of sacrifice, and the promise that heroes are never forgotten. Her plan required absolute secrecy. She couldn't risk the contract being canceled or her workers facing scrutiny. This tribute would be her personal mission, funded from her own savings and executed during late-night shifts when the factory was officially closed. Margaret began sketching designs, calculating measurements, and planning how to embed her secret message into millions of tiny fasteners. The work would be painstaking. Each button would require individual attention, special materials, and precise craftsmanship. But Margaret knew that some things mattered more than efficiency or profit. Some things required the touch of human hands and the guidance of a grieving heart. As she locked the factory that night, Margaret whispered a promise to the September sky. The fallen would not be forgotten. Their names would travel across America, hidden in plain sight, fastening together the uniforms of those who protected freedom. The first challenge was finding the right materials. Margaret needed thread that would be nearly invisible, but strong enough to last decades. She contacted suppliers across the country, claiming she was developing a new premium button line. After weeks of samples and testing, she discovered a specialized silk thread used in surgical sutures. It was incredibly fine, almost transparent, and designed to hold under extreme stress. Margaret's secret work began at midnight. After her regular employees went home, she would return to the factory with a small bag of special tools. She had purchased a high-powered magnifying glass and the finest needles money could buy. Her plan was ambitious and seemingly impossible. She would embroider the names of September 11th victims onto the underside of uniform buttons using thread so fine it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. The first name she chose was Father Michael Judge, the fire department chaplain who died giving last rites to a fallen firefighter. Margaret practiced for hours, learning to control her breathing so her hands wouldn't shake. The letters had to be microscopic, no larger than a pinhead, but perfectly formed. Each letter required dozens of tiny stitches, building the name one thread at a time. It took her 3 nights to complete the first button. When she finally held it under the magnifying glass, tears blurred her vision. There, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the name that honored a man who died serving others. Margaret attached this button to a sample uniform and wore it to work the next day. No one noticed anything different, but she felt the weight of remembrance against her chest. Word of the quality of Margaret's buttons began to spread. The uniform manufacturer praised the durability and perfect finish of her products. Orders increased, and Margaret realized she would need help to complete her secret mission. But who could she trust with something so personal and potentially controversial? She chose Elena Rodriguez, her most skilled seamstress and longtime friend. Elena had worked at the factory for 15 years and lost her nephew in the towers. He was a security guard who stayed behind to help evacuate the building. Margaret approached Elena carefully, explaining her plan during a quiet lunch break. Elena listened without speaking, her dark eyes reflecting both sorrow and determination. Elena agreed immediately. She understood the need to honor the fallen in a way that would last long after speeches were forgotten and memorials weathered by time. The two women began meeting every night after the factory closed. They divided the list of names, with Elena focusing on the Pentagon victims while Margaret continued with those from the World Trade Center. Their system became refined through practice. They would select buttons destined for specific types of uniforms. Police buttons carried the names of officers who died in the line of duty. Firefighter buttons honored the 343 members of the FDNY who climbed toward danger. Military uniform buttons bore the names of Pentagon personnel and the passengers who fought back on Flight 93. The work was emotionally exhausting. Each name represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, dreams that would never be fulfilled. Margaret and Elena would sometimes stop in the middle of their work, overwhelmed by the weight of what they were creating. But they pressed on, driven by the belief that memory is the most sacred gift we can offer to the dead. After 6 months, they had completed nearly 10,000 buttons. The secret tribute was spreading across America, carried by men and women who served their communities every day. Police officers in small towns wore buttons bearing the names of firefighters. Soldiers in training camps carried the memory of office workers who died at their desks. The invisible thread connected them all in a web of remembrance that stretched from coast to coast. Neither Margaret nor Elena spoke of their work to anyone else. It remained their shared burden and privilege. They kept detailed records of which names went on which buttons, tracking their secret memorial as it traveled across the country. Each evening, as they bent over their delicate work, they felt they were writing history one stitch at a time. 2 years into their secret project, Margaret and Elena faced an unexpected crisis. A quality control inspector from the uniform manufacturer arrived for a surprise inspection. James Walsh was known for his meticulous attention to detail and had caught defects that other inspectors missed. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched him examine her buttons under a powerful magnifying glass. Walsh spent hours checking seam strength, color consistency, and thread durability. He picked up button after button, turning them in the light, examining every surface. Margaret stood nearby, trying to appear casual while her stomach churned with anxiety. If he discovered the hidden names, the contract would be canceled immediately. Worse, the story might leak to the media and turn her tribute into a political controversy. Elena pretended to work at her sewing machine, but kept glancing toward the inspection station. She had hidden the special tools and materials, but evidence of their secret work was embedded in thousands of buttons throughout the factory. All it would take was one careful look at the right angle, and their project would be exposed. Hours passed before Walsh finally set down his magnifying glass. He turned to Margaret with a serious expression that made her knees weak. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. The buttons met every specification and exceeded quality standards. He complimented the precision of her work and recommended the company for additional contracts. As he packed his equipment, Margaret felt dizzy with relief. That evening, she and Elena decided to expand their operation. The close call had reminded them how fragile their project was, but also how important it had become. They recruited 2 more workers, both women who had lost family members in the attacks. Carmen Lopez had lost her brother, a paramedic who died responding to the Pentagon. Susan Kim's sister worked on the 97th floor of the South Tower and never made it out. The 4 women formed a secret sisterhood bound by grief and purpose. They called themselves the Night Shift, though officially no night shift existed at the button factory. Each woman specialized in different types of stitching and different categories of victims. Margaret handled firefighters and first responders. Elena worked on Pentagon personnel. Carmen focused on Flight 93 passengers and crew. Susan embroidered the names of World Trade Center office workers and visitors. Their technique improved dramatically with practice and collaboration. They developed codes to identify which buttons carried which names, creating an invisible catalog that only they could read. A tiny extra stitch in the corner indicated a firefighter. A barely perceptible color variation in the thread marked a police officer. The placement of the name, upper left, center, or lower right, identified whether the victim died at the World Trade Center, Pentagon, or in Pennsylvania. The emotional toll of the work deepened as they learned more about each person they honored. They read obituaries, watched news interviews with families, and sometimes attended memorial services. Each name became personal. They knew that Michael was planning to propose to his girlfriend, that Sarah had just started a new job she loved, that Robert coached Little League baseball and never missed a game. Margaret began keeping a journal, documenting their work. She recorded not just the names and locations, but the stories behind them. The journal grew thick with newspaper clippings, photographs printed from the internet, and handwritten notes about the victims' lives. She told herself it was for historical record, but really it was her way of ensuring that each person remained human, rather than just a name on a memorial wall. The project took on a life of its own. Carmen suggested they include the names of people who died from illness related to rescue and recovery efforts. Susan proposed adding the first responders, who took their own lives in the years following the attacks, unable to cope with what they had witnessed. The list of names grew longer, and their nightly work sessions extended deeper into the morning hours. By 2004, they estimated they had embedded over 30,000 names into buttons that now served across America. Police officers in Los Angeles wore buttons honoring New York firefighters. Military personnel in Texas carried the names of Pentagon employees. Emergency responders in rural communities bore the memory of people they never met, but whose sacrifice connected them all. The weight of keeping such a massive secret began to affect all 4 women. They found themselves looking at every uniform they encountered, wondering if it might carry one of their hidden tributes. Margaret would see a police officer at the grocery store and feel a surge of pride, knowing that somewhere on his uniform might be a button carrying the name of someone who died trying to save others. 7 years after the attacks, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. The voice belonged to Detective Michael Torres of the New York Police Department. He was calling from his partner's funeral, a veteran officer who had died of cancer linked to his work at Ground Zero. Torres was examining his dress uniform when something caught his eye under the bright chapel lights. Torres had noticed what appeared to be writing on the underside of one of his uniform buttons. Using a borrowed magnifying glass from the funeral director, he discovered a name embroidered in nearly invisible thread. The name was Jennifer Adams, a financial analyst who worked on the 103rd floor of the North Tower. Torres had never heard of her, but something about finding her name hidden on his uniform moved him deeply. He began examining every button on his uniform and found 2 more names. Each was perfectly stitched in microscopic letters, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Torres was a detective by training and nature. He couldn't let the mystery go. He traced the buttons back through supply records and eventually found Margaret's factory in Chicago. When Margaret answered Torres's call, she felt her secret world collapsing. But the detective's voice was gentle, filled with wonder rather than accusation. He explained what he had found and asked simply,
"Why?"
Margaret found herself crying as she told the story of her midnight project, the sisterhood of women who had spent years honoring the dead through invisible thread. Torres listened without interruption. When Margaret finished, there was silence on the line. Finally, he spoke. "Ma'am, I need you to know something. Jennifer Adams was my partner's sister. He joined the force because of what happened to her. He never knew her name was on his uniform, but somehow it feels right that she was there with him all these years." The conversation changed Margaret's perspective on their secret work. For 7 years, she had worried about discovery, about controversy, about whether they had the right to take such liberties. But Torres helped her understand that what they had created was bigger than any one person's approval or disapproval. They had woven memory into the fabric of American service, creating connections that transcended death. Torres asked if he could tell others about the hidden tributes. Margaret agreed, but with conditions. She didn't want publicity or recognition. This wasn't about the button factory or her business. It was about honoring people who deserved to be remembered. If the story was going to be told, it should focus on the victims and their families, not on the women who did the stitching. Word spread quietly through law enforcement and first responder communities. Police officers began examining their uniforms with magnifying glasses, looking for the hidden names. Firefighters gathered after shifts to help each other search their gear. Military personnel passed around reading glasses, hunting for the microscopic tributes embedded in their buttons. Each discovery created a moment of profound connection. A police officer in Denver found the name of a firefighter from New York and researched his story, learning about a man who saved 6 people before the towers fell. A paramedic in Florida discovered the name of a Pentagon employee and reached out to the victim's family, sharing how honored she felt to carry that memory with her to every emergency call. Margaret and her team watched these connections form with amazement. Their secret project was creating a network of remembrance that spanned the country. Service members who had never met were united by the names they carried. Families of victims found comfort knowing their loved ones' names traveled with America's protectors every day. The discovery also brought unexpected challenges. Some people questioned whether they had the right to use the victims' names without permission. Others worried about the religious implications of carrying names of people from different faiths. A few critics called it exploitation, turning tragedy into a political statement. Margaret addressed each concern personally. She had kept detailed records of every name and could explain the careful research that went into each selection. She emphasized that this was never about politics or religion, but about human dignity and the universal need to remember those who died serving others or simply going about their daily lives on a terrible morning. The night shift continued their work, but with new purpose. They no longer worked in secrecy, but in sacred trust. Families began contacting them directly, asking if their loved ones' names could be included in future buttons. Each request came with photographs and stories, filling Margaret's journal with faces and memories that made the embroidered names even more meaningful. Elena suggested they expand beyond September 11th victims to include other fallen heroes. They began adding the names of police officers killed in the line of duty, firefighters who died in service, and military personnel who gave their lives for their country. The invisible thread now carried forward not just the memory of a single tragic day, but the ongoing sacrifice of all who serve others. 10 years after Detective Torres's phone call, Margaret faced a crisis that threatened everything she had built. At 72, her eyesight was failing, and her hands trembled from arthritis. The microscopic embroidery that had once been meditative now required enormous effort and caused daily pain. Elena had retired the previous year, and Carmen was battling cancer. Only Susan remained from the original night shift. The button factory itself was struggling. Large manufacturers had moved production overseas, and Margaret could barely compete with mass-produced imports. Orders dwindled each month, and she had laid off most of her regular employees. The building needed repairs she couldn't afford, and the ancient machines required constant maintenance. Margaret knew she was running out of time, but the demand for memorial buttons had never been higher. Word of the hidden tributes had spread through military bases, police departments, and fire stations across the country. Families contacted Margaret daily, begging her to include their loved ones' names in the invisible memorial. Each request came with stories that broke her heart and strengthened her resolve to continue the work. Margaret decided to train a new generation of embroiderers. She reached out to art schools and textile programs, looking for students who might understand the sacred nature of the work. The response surprised her. Young people who had grown up in the shadow of September 11th felt deeply connected to the project. They saw it as their generation's responsibility to carry forward the memory of that day. 6 students joined what Margaret now called the Memorial Workshop. They ranged in age from 19 to 32, representing different backgrounds, skills, and perspectives. There was David, a textile arts graduate whose father was a police officer; Maria, whose grandmother had emigrated from El Salvador and instilled in her a deep respect for service; James, a veteran who had lost friends in Iraq and Afghanistan and understood the importance of remembering the fallen. Training. The new embroiderers proved more challenging than Margaret expected. The technical skills could be taught, but the emotional preparation took months. Each student had to learn not just how to create invisible stitches, but how to carry the weight of strangers' grief. They read victim biographies, studied family photographs, and attended memorial services to understand the lives behind the names they would embroider. The workshop developed new techniques that Margaret had never imagined. The younger embroiderers used digital microscopes and precision, instruments that made the work more accurate and less physically demanding. They created templates and patterns that standardized the lettering while maintaining the personal touch that made each button unique. Margaret was amazed by their innovations, but she insisted on maintaining the emotional connection that had always driven the project. Each embroiderer was assigned specific victims and required to learn their stories before beginning work. They kept journals documenting not just the technical aspects of their craft, but their feelings about the people they were honoring. The workshop also expanded the types of memorials they created. Beyond the traditional uniform buttons, they began working on special projects. A flag retirement ceremony received buttons carrying the names of all Medal of Honor recipients. A new firefighter training facility requested memorial plaques with names embroidered so finely they appeared to be part of the medal itself. Margaret's proudest moment came when the workshop received a commission from the September 11th Memorial Museum. They were asked to create a display showing the evolution of remembrance from the immediate aftermath of the attacks to the present day. Margaret worked with the curators to explain how her button project represented the human need to keep memory alive in tangible, personal ways. The museum display included buttons from different years, showing how the embroidery techniques had evolved and the list of honored names had grown. Visitors could use high-powered magnifying equipment to see the hidden names, and interactive displays explained the stories of the victims. The exhibit became one of the museum's most popular features, with visitors spending hours searching for names and learning about the lives they represented. As Margaret watched families discover their loved ones' names in the museum display, she realized her secret project had become something much larger than she ever imagined. What started as one woman's private tribute had grown into a national network of remembrance that connected thousands of people across generations and professions. The Button Factory building was scheduled for demolition, but the Memorial Workshop had found a new home in a converted warehouse donated by a grateful police officer whose brother's name had been carried on his uniform for 15 years. The new facility had proper lighting, modern equipment, and space for the archive of journals and photographs that documented each embroidered name. Margaret spent her final months at the workshop training the young embroiderers not just in technique, but in the philosophy of invisible remembrance. She taught them that their work was a form of prayer, a way of ensuring that heroism and sacrifice would never be forgotten, even when monuments crumbled and memorial services ended. Margaret Chen passed away peacefully on a September morning, 25 years after she first began her secret tribute. She died surrounded by the young embroiderers who had become like grandchildren to her, their hands still stained with the invisible thread that carried forward the names of heroes. Her final words were about the importance of remembering not just the famous or powerful, but everyone who lived with courage and died with dignity. The funeral brought together an extraordinary gathering of people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's work. Police officers from across the country attended in dress uniform, their buttons carrying hidden names that connected them to strangers who had become family. Firefighters stood honor guard, knowing that their gear bore the memory of brothers who had climbed into burning towers. Military personnel saluted a civilian who had found a way to embed valor into the fabric of service itself. Elena Rodriguez, now the workshop's director, delivered the eulogy. She spoke about Margaret's vision of invisible remembrance and how it had grown into something that touched every corner of American service. She revealed for the first time the full scope of the project. Over 25 years, Margaret and her embroiderers had created more than 2 million memorial buttons, each carrying at least one name, some carrying as many as 5 names layered, in different locations and different threads. The hidden memorial had spread far beyond its original mission. In addition to September 11th victims, the buttons now carried the names of fallen soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, police officers killed in the line of duty, firefighters who died battling wildfires, paramedics who lost their lives serving, their communities, and civilians who died in terrorist attacks around the world. The invisible thread connected not just America's heroes, but heroes from allied nations who had served alongside American forces. Elena announced that Margaret's work would continue through the Memorial Workshop Foundation, established with donations from the families of victims and the service members who had discovered their names embedded in uniform buttons. The foundation would train new embroiderers, maintain the archives that documented each honored life, and ensure that the tradition of invisible remembrance continued for future generations. The workshop had evolved far beyond Margaret's original Button Factory. Master embroiderers now worked on projects for military academies, police training centers, and fire departments worldwide. They created memorial quilts where each patch contained hundreds of microscopic names. They embroidered the names of fallen soldiers into the linings of military flags. They wove remembrance into the very fabric of honor itself. Young people continued to volunteer for the emotionally demanding work of memorial embroidery. They came from art schools and military families, from immigrant communities and small towns. all united by the belief that memory was sacred and that heroes deserved to be carried forward by those who followed in their footsteps. Each new embroiderer learned not just technique, but philosophy, understanding that they were part of a chain of remembrance that stretched back to a September morning when the world changed forever. The workshop maintained Margaret's original secrecy protocols for active service members. Police officers, firefighters, and military personnel still discovered names on their uniforms unexpectedly, creating moments of profound connection between the living and the dead. These discoveries generated thousands of letters to the workshop, with service members sharing how finding a hidden name had changed their understanding of their work and their connection to those who had sacrificed everything. International recognition came when the workshop was invited to create memorial buttons for the uniforms of honor guards at military cemeteries around the world. The invisible names would accompany the guards as they conducted ceremonies honoring the fallen, creating an unbroken chain of remembrance that transcended borders and languages. The project had become a universal symbol of how memory could be preserved through the simple act of careful, loving craftsmanship. Margaret's personal journal, filled with stories of the victims she had honored, became the foundation for a digital archive that connected names to histories, photographs to families, and memories to the people who carried them forward. Visitors to the archive could search for specific names and learn not just about how they died, but how they lived, loved, and contributed to the world before their lives were cut short. On the 25th anniversary of September 11th, Elena stood in the memorial workshop surrounded by young embroiderers bent over their microscopic work, their careful stitches adding new names to the invisible network of remembrance. Through the windows, she could see the city where it all began, forever changed, but somehow made stronger by the knowledge that heroes live on in the most ordinary places, carried by the most dedicated hands, remembered through the finest threads. The simple fastening that Margaret had chosen as her canvas had indeed held a secret tribute. But more than that, it had held together a nation's determination to never forget, woven into the very fabric of service, stitched into the heart of heroism itself, carried forward by invisible thread that bound the living to the dead in an unbreakable promise of eternal remembrance.